Thank you. Welcome everyone to day 2 of Africa's Readiness for Climate Change. Hope you are ready for another dynamic day filled with inspirational stories, innovative solutions, and new connections to expand your role in climate action. It is with great pleasure to introduce to you our next keynote speaker, Nnimmo Bassey. He is a dear old friend who I had the opportunity to be on a panel with discussing climate change in Australia 20 years ago. A few years later, I visited the Niger Delta and with my own eyes saw some of the tragic results due to the oil industry in that region. Oil spills and gas flares resulting in the destruction of the natural habitat and destroying the local cultural heritage. It is truly an honor to listen to this great poet, author, visionary, warrior, and educator who has never given up hope for his people and for our beautiful planet Earth, no matter what the challenges he has faced. This renowned African environmentalist will be speaking, as Andrew said, on the challenge of technology in the quest for environmental justice. He is a Nigerian architect, environmental activist, author, and poet, and is the founder and director of the Health of Mother Earth Foundation, an environmental think tank and advocacy organization. He was active on human rights issues in the 1980s, when he served on the board of directors of Nigeria's Civil Liberties Organization. In 1993, he co-founded and led the Nigerian NGO known as the Environmental Rights Action, Friends of the Earth Nigeria, for 20 years in order to advocate, educate, and organize environmental human rights issues in Nigeria. Since 1996, Bassey has served on the steering committee of both Oil Watch International and the regional arm Oil Watch Africa. The network strives to resist destructive oil, gas, and coal extraction activities and demands an urgent shift from the dominant petroleum fuel economy. His numerous awards, many, and recognitions include the 2009 Time Magazine Hero of the Environment, the Right Livelihood Award in 2010, known as the Alternative Nobel Prize, the Rafto Prize in 2012, and recently in 2019, an honorary degree from York University, UK. Nnimmo Bassey, thank you for being here. Take over.
Thank you so much, Annie, and thanks a lot to the African Studies Department at UCLA and, of course, Earth Rights Institute for putting this together and for inviting me to be a part of it. We are indeed living in very challenging times, and we're living in this beautiful world, and as Andrew said, beautiful but warming planet. Some people think that the warming is not too bad, but for those who are already neck deep in the floods and droughts and challenges, it's already too bad. It's really a big challenge. But nevertheless, we are hopeful that humans do care about the planet and we do care about ourselves. And so the necessity of taking action to tackle global warming cannot be overemphasized at this time. We are hopeful that also that the COVID-19 pandemic would not slow down the response to global warming as it did last year, because even the Conference of Parties that was to meet in Glasgow last year did not hold, and there was not even a virtual version as we are having this conference today. And so there was very much was lost last year just because nations could not even discuss about what they're doing to see how little they're moving forward towards tackling global warming. And this is very central to what we want to discuss this evening, because what is on the cards at the discussions on global warming currently is about voluntary contributions by nations about what actions they're going to take towards tackling global warming, which is known as the NDC's nationally determined contributions. We believe that leaving nations to determine what to do is actually a way of offering nations opportunities to do nothing. We've seen from the pandemic that rather than cooperating and doing things together, we see nationalism taking the upper room or upper level when it comes to access to vaccines. Nations do all they can to grab everything without caring that this is a global phenomenon. So I'll be talking about the challenge of technologies to climate justice. And I'm looking at it from the perspective of two major groups of technologies. But before then, let me just emphasize that the roots of the global warming that we have today can be traced back to colonialism, which led to a lot of land grabbing, territory grabbing, hoisting of flags and territories and taking over everything. And then the whole logic of colonial ecology, which includes colonial conservation means, includes colonial agriculture, which is of course plantation agriculture, monoculture agriculture, all for exports and nothing for the local economies in Africa and other areas. So as we look at Africa's readiness for climate change, the technologies I'll be discussing today are technologies that actually make it impossible, that may make it impossible for Africa to be ready for global warming. And then when you look at the historical antecedent, the challenges of colonialism, of neocolonialism, the capitalist mode of thinking, which is mostly exploitation, grabbing, and externalization of harms to the environment and to people. Then we look at the imperial power structures, then we can just see that things are fairly negative at the moment. So the challenge for Africa is that the history has made us vulnerable, then the hazards are increasing. And so you can say this is a disaster zone. It's a zone of major crisis. This includes all the harms you would think about when you talk about global warming: sea level rise, coastal erosion, desertification, droughts, loss of agricultural land and capacity to grow needed crops in particular areas, water stress across much of the continent from Cape Town to the tip of to Cairo. You can know that water has become a major issue when talking about global warming. Then all this connotes loss of livelihoods and also displacement of populations, a lot of environmental climate refugees in Africa, both internally and externally. Hear the stories about what is going on in the Mediterranean Sea, as well as what is going on in the Sahara Desert, as people who are pressed by global warming are looking for a way out of harm's way. This map on the screen shows a serpentine, something like a rope going across the continent. That is known as the Great Green Wall, proposed by the African Union, starting from Djibouti all the way to Dakar in Senegal. It's 15 kilometers deep, and this is a whole long stretch across the continent. It's meant to be a green belt and to stop the spread of the desert into the Sahel, further into the Sahel, because the Sahel is already very challenged. We're hoping that if this green belt becomes a zone with indigenous trees that are really climate smart, not engineered in the lab, but trees that understand the environment that the people interact with and are beneficial to the communities, then this would be a very healthy and busy economic zone, as well as a zone that would tackle the impacts of global warming and mitigate the impacts of global warming right across the continent. And it would have implication that a belt of trees across that zone, the Sahelian zone, will have a big impact on the climate situation across the continent and elsewhere in the world. Now, if you look at the key targets of the Paris Agreement is that the world should aim for maximum of on the optimum optimum target temperature target is 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels or well below 2 degrees. And we do know that much of this carbon in the atmosphere is put there by burning of fossil fuels. And the issue, again, related to this is that the world is not making any seriously conscious effort to stop dependence on fossil fuels. Many countries are still looking for, exploring for more fossil fuels as the fossil fuel industries look for ways to more or less scrape the bottom of the barrel before the world shift completely away from fossil fuels and move more into renewable sector. Now, statisticians and researchers have looked at the developed fossil fuel resources in Africa. They've also looked at the newly found fossil fuels, the coal, the gas, the oil, and they've checked the scenario. What would happen if there's no further development of fossil fuel sector on the continent? So even if we depend only on burning the existing developed fossil fuel systems, we would barely meet the target of 1.5 degrees in terms of what is contributed from the continent. If we do business as usual and just burn everything, including those that are being researched for, being explored right now, then of course everything goes off the chart. We'll go way above 2 degrees Celsius. Now, the climate impacts on the continent have been very dramatic, especially on the southeast board of Africa. We had in March 2019 Cyclone Idai, which was attributed to the warming of the Indian Ocean. That cyclone was very ferocious, killed over 1,000 people. Cyclone Kenneth came shortly after that, killed about 50 people, destroyed communities, destroyed infrastructure. The harm done by Cyclone Idai in Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Madagascar, Malawi, totaled more than $2 billion, and much more harm came up with Kenneth. And this year in 2021, we had Cyclone Eloise, and more damage was done. And the challenge here, the interesting thing to note about the cyclones on southeastern border of Africa is that the more the Indian Ocean gets warmer, the more the impact of cyclones getting up on the latitude, creeping up the coast of Africa to areas they never used to experience this kind of cyclones. So if action is not taken to tackle global warming right now, we're going to have more floods across the continent and more droughts, more desertification, more coastal erosion, and vulnerability meeting hazards will create the ultimate disaster one could think about. So the emerging technologies I want to focus on in this conversation and hopefully try to show the negative impact we have on not just Africa, but globally, gene drives and geoengineering. Gene drives talks about it's a method of ensuring that a higher proportion of an organism's offspring inherit a certain species, a certain trait, or a selfish gene that allows mutation or maybe a foreign gene to spread quickly through an entire population. It is a way of making changes to an entire population of a specific species by changing or altering its genetic material. This is something very important because it has a lot of implication. In traditional genetic engineering, you take a DNA material from one species to another to confer on the new or on the target crop or animal a certain trait, maybe to make it herbicide tolerant or pest resistant or whatever. Then those ones could still be controlled, but in the new technology of gene drive, you can have global drives that the genetic change will spread throughout the entire species and probably lead to extinction. And this has implication for those who are not into this technology. And then there could be those that could be engineered so that it could undo the effect of the global drive. In other words, like having a gear system in a car, you keep moving forward, then you can halt and reverse. Then you can have the daisy drive, which is programmed to stop working after a certain number of generations. All these are very, very interesting, very interesting. There are two charts, two illustrations on this slide. On this end, you see how things work when when you change the types, the genetic material of in a species, one colored black, one with a different color, and then they start to breed. Then eventually you can have, in a sense, where they don't become uniform at the end of the day. But you can have another one that the genetic material spreads so that at the end of the day, the entire black version of variety is wiped out. Now, this has a very, within just for, this was an experiment done with flies, fruit flies, and in 4 generations, you will have wiped out one particular type. Now, the implication of this is that gene drives can be used in agriculture in terms of eliminating one species or conferring one particular trait that would go throughout the entire, that particular species, and they would not one would be left out. You could use them in military, in warfare. It could be used to produce bioweapons. It could be used in medicine, of course, and it could also be used in conservation. Conservation in terms of, in the sense that you could use this technology to wipe out species that some people think are not necessary, and then promote those that some people think is essential. So what is thought to be dangerous could be wiped out. But the implication of this is that while you can use this in industrial agriculture, you can also use it in bioterrorism or in military warfare. You could use it to fight disease. For example, in Mozambique, in Burkina Faso rather, there's been an effort to introduce genetically modified mosquitoes, Anopheles mosquitoes that would not spread the disease, and then eventually to bring in gene-drive mosquitoes to finally annihilate the mosquito-carrying, the malaria-carrying version of the mosquitoes, Anopheles mosquitoes in that territory. There are many, many arguments against this. One is that we don't know you can know the beginning, but you don't know the ending. And even when you're doing the experiment, you can't lock the mosquitoes within a village, that they will not go across the borders and even go beyond the countries. If a mosquito that's genetically engineered enters a car, wherever the car drives, you could just go up there and that could go to different locations. So there are arguments for and against this. So the dangers of this engineering, this technology, is that there could be unintended consequences that could be negative. They could be used to disrupt ecological balance. And really, as we're getting closer to Earth Day, we should be talking about balance, keeping the ecological balance. Keeping the balance is very healthy for many communities, especially communities who live closer to the environment. And of course, the world should learn to live in harmony with the natural ecosystems. This kind of technology could also disrupt and alter power relations, geopower relations, and lead to negative relationship between nations. We talk about unintended consequences. We talk about being weaponized for use for military, and then there could be another kind of power to colonize and control. And then, of course, we'll promote if investment is from certain groups of people, then it would also entrench power in certain corporations. Now, another technology which I did not mention is synthetic biology, which seeks to replace natural products with artificial or synthetic products. This would affect communities in Africa, especially who cultivate or gather natural products which they sell to industry for making of perfumes, confectionaries, and many other things. And so if synthetic products replace natural products, it will throw many economies out of balance and would weaken the resilience of communities and weaken the capacity of communities to withstand certain adverse changes, including global warming in their neighborhoods, in their territories and countries. Now, again, to make some of these synthetic products at scale will require a lot of land to cultivate, to produce the raw materials. And this could lead to land grabbing, and a lot of land grabbing has been going on in Africa and elsewhere in the global south. I mentioned the use of synthetic biology and the way communities produce different crops for small farmers, make this kind of for industry that make flavors for food, and those that produce fragrances and other things. And so this technology, while sounding and looking very beautiful and looking like it could actually save the ecosystems, could also adversely affect workers and farmers and communities who depend on taking care of their forests so as to get the products out to industries and to other good people who need them. And so what we're saying is that this gene drives and synthetic biology, if not controlled, could lead to the trashing of the global south, disrupting of ecological balance, dislocation of populations and livelihoods, and create a weakening of the ecosystems and the people. It could also mean turning fertile lands to become wastelands. And we have a lot of logic about which lands in Africa can be useful and which are not useful, just to promote or to support certain arguments. And we think that all this should be interrogated, and we should look at exactly what is useful and what is not useful. Now, the second group of technology I want to discuss briefly before I round up this presentation about the emerging technologies and the challenge to climate and environmental justice in Africa is geoengineering. And geoengineering has been defined as a set of proposed techniques and technologies to deliberately intervene in and alter Earth systems on a large scale. They can be carried out at planetary, they can only be carried out at planetary scales. And the whole thing is to fix the climate crisis. And I must say that this is this is a major issue for us to consider when we look at how negotiations have been going on, and how some articles in the Paris Agreement has been couched. The politicians always mention that technology is needed to tackle global warming. And it's true that technology is needed, but the issue is what kind of technology is needed. If we talk about geoengineering, which some people call climate engineering, there are three basic types: the greenhouse gas and carbon dioxide removal, and the solar radiation management, and weather modification. Greenhouse gas removal means you keep on emitting the greenhouse gases, then you capture them from the atmosphere and put them somewhere else. While solar radiation management means reflecting sunlight back into space to reduce the warming effect of this kind of radiation. The weather modification would mean manipulating and modifying the weather. Weather modification has been going on for quite a while, following the way, been going on about even utilize in certain conditions to manage rainfall and so on and so forth. So the technologies we talk about, a lot of them target terrestrial ecosystems and carbon capture and storage, carbon capture, use and storage, or all this lock-in dependence on fossil fuels. And I'm so concerned about this, because the more fossil fuel dependency is retained, the more we believe we cannot look beyond hydrocarbons or petroleum civilization, then the more many communities in the global south are trashed. The Niger Delta is one of the most polluted places on planet Earth. The tar sand mines of Canada should be one of the horrible places that you can do any kind of extractive activities in the world, and you find it spread across many places. And so if the world believes that you can keep polluting, then capture the carbon, then a lot of these ecological harms, which can be described as ecocide, will continue unheeded. And then we have afforestation issues, mega cultural plantations, which is again a colonial idea. Monoculture plantations were promoted in colonies to feed industries in the metropoles of the imperial centers. Then direct air and air capture is the same as keep burning, capture it and bury it. Then there are some case proposals for enhanced weathering, which could also enhance extracting minerals from crops. You break the crops in a way that they, at the same time as they're weathering, they're getting weathered, they also reflect radiation and help to manage the things that come into that relates to global warming. Then I'll just move to the next slide because a lot of what is in this other slide displayed here. So we look at the way the ocean, the land, and the air is utilized, is proposed to be utilized in geoengineering to tackle global warming. This includes spreading sulfur aerosols sulfides in the atmosphere, just to mimic what happens when there's a volcanic eruption, so as to cool the planet, or whitening the clouds by pumping salt seawater from the ocean into the clouds. This will be whitening the clouds to reflect more radiation back into the atmosphere, or placing mirrors in the orbit to reflect, also mirrors to reflect radiation back into space. I think this one is interesting to me. Genetically engineering crops to make the leaves white, so I can have albedo effect of then they could just reflect back the heat, or then intensifying the capacity of crops to be more efficient in terms of photosynthesis, so they absorb more carbon, then they sink the carbon into the roots with a deep root system. Then in the ocean, again, there's a proposal to use ion filings to fertilize the ocean so as to trigger algae blooms, which would absorb carbon and then sink to the bottom of the ocean and keep the carbon there. But the issue is, for how long will the carbon remain at the bottom of the ocean? Maybe for 100 years, for 1,000 years, 1 million years. Then what happens to future generation? We're trying to delay action and then so that the future generations will have to combat and tackle this. Then, of course, there's also the issue of pumping fossil fuels back into the wells. Like in Niger Delta, a lot of gas associated with crude oil extraction is being fled. So one thing that the government proposed was that this should be re-injected. Now, oil companies have rejected gas in some instances, but this can also be used to pump out more crude oil. You pump in the gas, push out more crude oil, and burn the crude oil. Keeps on this creates more problems for us in terms of global warming, because it puts more carbon in the atmosphere. Now, when you put sulfates in the stratosphere to cool the climate or do all these things, whatever is done in terms of geoengineering would have to continue in perpetuity, because once those things stop or fail, then what was held back would suddenly jump up. So you would have sudden temperature rise if you stop, and you have continual water acidification. The ocean is already getting acidified, so if that intensifies, there'll be more problems. Then you'll reduce efficiency of solar energy generation. And then, of course, whoever controls the planetary weather systems might as well be the field marshals of the world and could control the world militarily and control the thermostat of the planet. I don't think it's something that anybody wants to promote. And putting things, any time humans engineer or find a way to disrupt the natural cycles of Mother Earth, their implications and their actions. And from computer models that we've seen about the use of geoengineering, there are places that will have positive impacts, and there are places that will have negative impacts. And most of the negative impacts will be in vulnerable poor countries, like continents like Africa. And we are really worried about this kind of technologies, which will reduce our readiness for global warming rather than enhance it. And so none of the techniques is actually aimed to address the root cause of global warming, but just to treat the symptoms and postpone the evil day, so to speak, of when action must be taken. So, yeah, it's actually, if we have this technology used widely or used by certain power structures, it's really a perfect excuse to avoid taking real action. And the challenge, another challenge that we should mention here is that we remind ourselves that geoengineering can only be carried out at planetary scale. You can't do a small scale test in the atmosphere, in the sky. It has to be big enough for you to see the impact. Otherwise, the test will be done in the computer modeling or in the laboratory. So it's actually very impossible to test this without going out there. And there's a moratorium about testing this, and there's no strict law to regulate or to ban this, which is what should actually be done. So the impacts will be it's unreliable, the impacts will be unequal, and people can just take unilateral action without consultation across the world, without being agreed by everybody, and it could just create a lot of problems and marketize the atmosphere in a way that we cannot imagine. So some people say, well, why are you complaining about gene technologies campaigning against geoengineering? Are you against science? No, we are not against science. We want science that works in favor of people, that creates peace and helps the Mother Earth sustain, does not destroy or disrupt Mother Earth. We want science that does real work and not just promote production of hardware for certain industries. We don't want to lock in fossil fuel industry and get people dependent on a few power structures. We don't want the planet to become a test laboratory. And of course, because we know that you cannot carry this test out at a small scale, then it's something that is the intensity magnitude of what we're talking about is enormous and really, truly scary. Now, the first president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, in his book, Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, said, and I quote, the worst form of imperialism, he said, for those who practice it, it means power without responsibility, and for those who suffer it, it means exploitation without redress. Neocolonialism, like colonialism, is an attempt to export the social conflict of the capitalist countries. We see this happening all the time. And I just thought that this was a good quote for us to reflect on as we bring this conversation to a close. Two tracks we've looked at this evening, two kinds of engineering, gene drive engineering, which is extreme biotechnology, and then geoengineering. All these are things that are not firmly regulated in the world today, but technology is going far ahead of regulations. We don't need to get scared about technology advance. We need technology, but we want technology to be subject to the control of people. You don't want a few people who become giants in certain technologies. Even right now, the advances in agriculture, big data companies are now getting into the driving seat, promoting what they call precision agriculture, that would know the quality of the soil, the kind of seed, where to plant it, and drones will go around planting. And then you change the whole picture of farming, which means changing the entire picture of cultures and re-engineering human society. All these are things that we need to discuss technology, not just what happens in the lab, but the ethical implications. We need to discuss the cultural implications, social implications, and see how do we want to build solidarity? How are we going to build a society that's resilient to withstand global warming? What will make Africa ready to withstand global warming that is already attacking the continent, already having serious impact on the continent? Is it technologies that Africa has no control over? Or is it something that Africa has control over? And what does Africa have control over? What Africa has in control is what all of humanity has the capacity to have in control. Working with one another, working with Mother Earth, believing in Ubuntu, believing in our interrelationships and our connection, knowing that a good life is not about power. A good life is about love. And this is what we're talking about, loving the planet, being in harmony with the planet, and not getting carried away by technology just because we can carry out experiments. And I'll pause at this point, and I thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Nnimmo Bassey, for a wonderful keynote. We will be moving on to the Q&A, and I just wanted to let you know that we initially planned on opening the session with poetry because Nnimmo himself is a poet, but our poet that was going to be joining us had some issues joining, such as Zoom Live. So she will actually be closing the session with some of her poetry. But before that, we will go ahead and take some questions. Please feel free to submit using the Q&A feature that is at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I will read them out loud, and perhaps Andrew and Annie will also help interlocute, and we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions. Okay, so I see a couple of questions coming in already, so I will go ahead and read the question that came in from Soliver, and I apologize if I mispronounce anyone's name. So the question that Oliver has, first he's saying, thank you so much for putting into words what I have been feeling as an engineering student. Question is, do you have any thoughts for African students studying in the US in departments that heavily support a lot of these technocratic fixes?
Yes, we really get worried about that. There are some institutions in the United States that are more or less programmed to push these wrong technologies onto the continent. And they don't only teach the students who are in the universities, they're getting groups of journalists from Africa to come over to the United States to be indoctrinated on how beautiful, how there's no solution, for example, that they call climate smart agriculture, which is genetically engineered, whereas the real climate smart agriculture is crops that are used to the environment, that are adapted to the ground, that have been developed by our farmers over hundreds and thousands of years. Those are suitable for the culture, for the weather, the climate, and everything. So yes, that's a big challenge. But I think the issue for any African student or any student, whether you're from Africa, from anywhere in the world, whatever you study, you have to understand the political foundation, whether it's engineering or not. There's politics behind engineering. There's nothing that is 1 + 1 = 2. There are some arguments behind everything. Even before an experiment is carried out, there's a reason for it to be carried out. So you have to look at what has locked in our thinking in a certain way. What makes us believe, if you're an agricultural student, or what makes in Africa, for example, governments always talk about plantation agriculture. People talk about cash cropping. Why? Because when governments think about agriculture, it's about money, not about food. It's about growing things for export, for factories, whereas there's a lot of food shortages in communities, if not farmers. And so we need to look at the politics of hunger to understand what kind of food should we produce. And then we look at the impact on global warming. Then we should necessarily look at what are the solutions. And the solution is simple. The solution to global warming is simple. Keep the fossils in the ground. And we've been saying this for donkey years. Keep the oil in the soil, keep the coal in the hole, and keep the tar sands in the land. The more you bring these things out and burn them, the more you compound the problem. So the solution is actually very simple. But the simplest solutions are the most complex for politicians and for corporate giants to accept, because all they want is to make profit. Don't care about the planet.
Thank you for your answer, and thank you for the questions, Oliver. So, Andrew, are you answering Alma's question, or should I ask? I see that you have.
No, that was a mistake.
Okay, so then I will present Alma's question. So also thank you again for a very thought-provoking presentation. Alma asked, are there conversations ongoing at higher levels on the continent around these issues, around what you presented?
Well, I am an activist who works with grassroots, so I keep my ears on the ground. There are a lot of conversations going on with this on the ground. We try what we can to penetrate government circles. We are pushing our governments about this, but I can assure you that the government's ears are open to transnational corporations. They're open to the big philanthropic capitalists in the world today, and you know who they are, who are writing books on climate change and proposing strange solutions. Yes. So there are discussions, but the discussion has not penetrated the ears that we would want to have them listen. But the grassroots networks on the continent are actually pushing very hard. For example, the African Food Sovereignty Alliance, which is an African-wide alliance, is doing serious work campaigning agroecology, which is actually one way to cool the planet. People say agriculture is one of the biggest contributors to carbon in the atmosphere, but people don't really say that it's not just agriculture, it's industrial agriculture. Agroecology, which fits Local small-scale agriculture produce 70% of the food people are eating in the world, and using about 30% or less of the resources. Using less land, farmers are struggling, they're producing the food that they will continue to feed the world into the future, but they're getting very little support. So our campaigns are about tackling coloniality, decolonizing the mind, especially for political leaders to begin to think and see the things that are more effective and more people-friendly, and that would not get our countries to more debt by getting trapped by these high-cost technologies when there are very simple solutions on hand.
Okay, thank you. Park asked an excellent question. I think that thanks for this wonderful presentation. Are there some places or examples where the technologies you mentioned have been implemented?
Yes, there are some places maybe not implemented, but experimentation has been going on in countries in Africa, in East Africa and West Africa. And I mentioned one example in my presentation about efforts to introduce genetically engineered mosquitoes in Burkina Faso. That has met big resistance, but the communities where the tests to be carried out is more or less militarized. So that there's a lot of human rights abuses already to ensure that people don't complain about these technologies. So these technologies are not things that people say, okay, we love them, we want them, but things that are being forced top down on people. And people don't have enough information about it, so they can't really say whether they want it or not. They hear it from one side, and the governments and the corporations don't want the communities to get to hear the other side. And what we're saying is that let's be on the table, let's present the two sides, and then people decide what they want. I'm particularly very worried about Nigeria. We have a regulatory system that is totally open to accepting anything. And we stand together and we confront this institution regularly, both in terms of litigation in the court. We have court cases against the government on some of these technologies, and we are still going to have more challenges because we don't want this. If this take root in Africa, in Nigeria, then Africa is sunk. We have seen biotechnology fail. The traditional agricultural modern biotechnology, which is GMO 101, that has not been able to penetrate widely in the continent, but even where it has penetrated, it failed woefully in Burkina Faso. In Nigeria, there are still tentative steps about so many crops have been approved already, and we're waiting to see, we're trying to stop this from spreading further. So there are experiments going on the continent, but yeah.
Okay, thank you. And we have another question from Michael Olabisi, who's actually one of our presenters on Friday. He asked, are the existing governance structures, national governments, regional organizations, subnational governments, the UN, adequate to addressing the global challenge that climate change presents?
That's complex. But let me just try. In terms of geoengineering, that is being debated United Nations in the Convention of Biodiversity CBD process. It's been debated. At the point there was a moratorium on it, but I think there's been a lot of work being done by power structures behind the scene to get that lifted so that there could be more experimentation. So the United Nations actually has been, I would like to say, is suffering a lot of corporate capture, because even when many of the climate change meetings have been sometimes sponsored by fossil fuel industries, and when you have them influencing the discussions and even the hosting of the conferences, you can be sure that they do all they can to lock in fossil fuels, which is a major promoter and cause of global warming. So if you have those who are caught burning the planet also on the driving seat in terms of finding solutions, can be sure that nobody's going to find the solution. That's why the world today has the nationally determined contributions, where countries can decide what they want to do and what they don't want to do. Africa has contributed less than 3% of the carbon stock in the atmosphere, whereas North America and Europe contribute over 30% each of the amount of carbon in the atmosphere historically and currently. So the question is, shouldn't polluters do their fair share? Why are you trying to share the burden when the burden has always been, share the burden in terms of putting more burden on those who have been bearing the burden all this while?
Okay, thank you. That is a difficult question to answer for sure, but that actually kind of takes us into another question by Amma. How is the conversation about exploration for fossil fuels going on in the African continent? I think the question that she's really focused on is how can African countries develop if we do not continue to delve for national resources such as fossil fuels?
That would be a whole book, to take a whole book to respond to that question. But I can tell you that there's a big governments get extremely attracted to extractive industry because it's one quick way to get revenue. And most of the resources in Africa are extracted for export, not for use on the continent. And so you find the infrastructure coming from the heartland of the continent, all going to the seaport or to get the products out of the continent. And so there's very little value addition to the continent. Extractivism would never develop Africa if development is what we understand by if comparing ourselves to other parts of the regions in the world. They say we reinvent development, which is something we need to do really, considering that we need to build a new future for the planet. But currently, the way the relationship between resources and transformation of those resources, the way it's organized, Africa doesn't stand a chance at all. In terms of, in some countries, the government don't get more than 1 or 2% of the revenue or from resources coming to the public purse. A lot of the money goes to the industries who are the ones who are the operators. And in Africa, many countries are finding crude oil, and it's very sad. Uganda has found crude oil. They want to build a pipeline. This is a heavy kind of crude that will go over 4,000 kilometers from Uganda to Tanzania to an export terminal for export again. And this is a pipeline that you have to hit along the way so as to keep the oil fluid to move in the pipeline. And it's passing through wetlands, passing through the southwestern border of Lake Victoria, one of the biggest freshwater system on the continent, where farmers, thousands, or if not millions of farmers depend on. So if that pipeline if that pipeline is built and there's a disruption somewhere, it's going to be catastrophic. The impact will be catastrophic for not just one country, but for the entire region. So we find these countries, I've been doing an assessment of the future of crude oil in Africa, and I find that many of our governments don't really derive much benefit from the resource, but rather when the resource is extracted, number one is that a lot of revenue goes to the national purse abroad, and then the country becomes credit worthy. The international financial institution will ask the country, look, you have a lot of credit, you are credit worthy, why don't you borrow? And then the countries begin to borrow and go into a debt that they cannot pay back, because in fact, there's no future for fossil fuels, let me say. 2020 showed the collapse of fossil fuel prices. Oil prices fell below $40. In Texas, they went below zero. But now they're coming up again up to $50, $60 a barrel. And it's only about $50 a barrel that you start to meet the break even. If you're extracting this resource, then you start to make profit. But when you have a situation where the oil industries are what do you call them? The producers, or there's a term for that, it just escaped me. They are the ones who are the driving seat. And so they determine the cost of production. And they have to take that cost out of the pot, first of all, before they now begin to divide what is left. And so countries accept this to happen, and the corporations can fix any pricing right down to the water they drink in their restaurants and the toothpick they use to pick their golden teeth, after eating lavish meals. And countries have to pay for this. And so really, the truth is, the benefits from the resources of these fossil fuels on the continent, they go to the corporations and go to corrupt politicians. Now, this corruption is not African, it's built by the same industry. Because if the industry does not corrupt the politician, they cannot carry out the kind of exploitation that they carry out.
Okay, so we are nearing what is going to be kind of the end of the Q&A session, but I do want to pose 2 more questions from the audience before we move on with the program. So this question is from Faith, and I think it ties into a question posed by Amma as well. Faith is a bit cynical after my own heart as well, but asking, considering the fact that each technology proposed to counter climate change has negative outcomes that people do not want to address, Should we consider sustainable development to be an illusion in Africa as of now? And Alma adds, what gives you hope?
Oh, what is the hope? That's the easy one to answer. The hope is that we are humans and we are beings. And we just have to realize there are other beings who have a right to be on this planet. 2 days from now, we're having Earth Day 2021. And Earth Day is not just for humans, for everyone, for all the visible and invisible beings who are with us. And so I'm hopeful that our eyes will be open and we realize that other beings have a right to dwell on this planet. Because if humans would destroy our chances of survival on the planet will carry on without humans. In fact, the planet would thrive without humans. We're the worst predators in the neighborhood. And if humans are away from here, things will really be good on planet Earth. But you will not see it because you will be, because you may not be around to see if humans are. If you've gone to Mars, it takes you 6 months to get to Mars. By the time you get to Mars, you will just be something else, be a fraction of what you were on Earth. Anyway, so this is a big problem. Almost all the technologies and solutions are contrary, but then we have solutions that are also positive and have no negative effect. For example, agroecology, stop industrial production. Industrial agriculture produces food for machines and for animals, basically. I mean, they're feeding the livestock industry. It's like dog eat dog. I mean, you have in this cycle of grabbing all the fish from off the coast of West Africa, turning into fish meal, feeding to poultry farms or whatever, and then without feeding the humans. And then people who depend on natural resources, the gift of nature, cannot afford to buy or to have access to this thing, what nature has given us. And so agroecology cools the planet, produces food that people need, healthy food, engages people in productive work. So it keeps the economy vibrant, it keeps people healthy, it keeps the planet cool. What else can be a better win-win? And that's just one. And then keeping the oil, the fossils in the ground, makes us responsible. And in fact, we just need to be ready to inconvenience ourselves a bit. We are still used to comfort. We're used to the current system of life. We can't imagine reducing the lifestyle, but whether we're ready, it's better to be ready to do that, manage the decline of global warming, of fossil fuel dependence. Let the powerful countries stop tomorrow dependence on fossil fuel. Then the other countries gradually, maybe over a period of 10, 20 years, get wind of. And leapfrogging in terms of energy change is very possible. Why can't we insist on distributed renewed energy across the world? We can't keep investing in big national grids. Well, we don't anymore invest in big telephone lines going all over the place. Nobody's extending telephone. I don't know whether anybody's extending telephone lines. We all have wireless systems. And so the same has to happen in terms of power generation. But if we keep on thinking about fossil fuel generated power, we have to keep thinking about expanding the grid lines. And this is simply not the way to go into the future.
This ties into one other question that I think is presented by Winifred. Are there safer geoengineering technologies that you would say we can pursue than others?
Sorry, say that again.
Are there geoengineering technologies that you would say are safer to pursue than others?
None.
Okay.
But I mean, many of the geoengineering experiments are not actually to tackle, the experiments are to sell hardware. Factories want to produce equipment to sell, whether they're going to work or not, whether they will save the tackle global warming or not, but they will make, there's a lot of money available, a lot of research going on, which is okay to do research. I believe that our scientists need to work even more in the laboratory, but this is something you cannot test in the lab effectively. You can have all the computer models, but you need to go out there to test it in the open. And once you go into the open, you can't respect political or geographic boundaries because we're out there in the atmosphere and you're going to do things on my behalf, things that will affect me without my consent. And I think that is not acceptable.
Okay, Thank you. I mean, I feel given that response, Camilia's question might have a similar response, but Camilia is actually a molecular biologist, and she has a question about a different kind of engineering. Her question is, as precipitation and global temperature projected changes, do you see any value in using genetic engineering to understand plants' genomes so we can better predict what plants will be better suited for these changes? Do you see any value in genomic engineering? If we use conventional breeding, it will take us years to understand these adaptations.
I wish I could say no comment, but I would not do that. I don't want to sound all negative, but genetic engineering has a place in medicine, definitely. It may has a place in bioterrorism. It has a place, I mean, biosecurity, not bioterrorism. We don't want to promote terrorism, but in terms of biosecurity, you need to understand what people who are not helpful could do, so you could counter it. It could be okay for examining those things in the laboratory, but I don't believe that anybody should alter varieties out there in a way that cannot be recorded. The challenge with modern genetic engineering is that the products, the plants and the animals don't necessarily look different from natural varieties, but they are not the same. If you introduce a new animal species in an environment, for example, if you bring rabbits, like when the British took rabbits to Australia, there were no rabbits in Australia until the British took a few rabbits there, and they wanted to have a sense of England in Australia. Then within a few years, they had millions of rabbits all over the place. So they had to start trapping them, poisoning them, killing them, shooting them, because you could see a rabbit and say, this is a rabbit, it doesn't belong here. But if when you genetically engineer a crop and release it into the environment, there's no way of knowing which crop is natural and which is genetically engineered. But the thing is that we are not also certain if they behave the same. They look alike physically, doesn't mean that they are alike genetically. They are not. And what will be the impact if we eat them? And what will be the impact to the environment generally? These are things that we don't have certainties over, and we just need more time, do more research, let there be more time. Don't be afraid of time passing. We need to be sure what we are doing before we release anything into the environment.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that question.
Erica?
Yes.
Can I jump in for a second?
Yes.
And then I know we're running late, but I just wanted to let everyone know that the purpose of this forum is about, the alternatives. And so what Nnimmo Bassey, with his Health of Mother Earth Foundation, is about coming together with indigenous knowledge combined with science and doing things like regenerative initiatives. And that movement is what we need to accelerate so that people can have an alternative in choices. So am I correct, Nnimmo?
Absolutely. We invest a lot of time in, one major track of our work is called Ikike, which means the right to generate, or to get knowledge and to share knowledge and to learn in two Nigerian languages. And so we do a lot of learning, and we're looking for alternatives all the time.
Okay. Thank you. I really love that you were today's keynote presenter, because our panel immediately following this session is filled with engineers. So I love that you are challenging some of these engineering solutions and really trying to ground it in indigenous frameworks, and propose that we both take some time to consider solutions to make sure that they are not causing more harm than good, but also that we really think about different ways of going about these solutions. And that said, I want to thank you again for this incredible keynote presentation, to our audience for the excellent questions, and to you again for these wonderful answers. As I mentioned earlier, that Nnimmo Bassey wears many hats and has many roles that he plays, and among them is that of poet. And actually for that reason, and partially also because politics, economics, all solutions are culturally embedded, we want to make sure that culture, the arts, were heavily featured throughout the ARC forum, we wanted to actually invite a poet to introduce Nnimmo and to launch the forum today. Unfortunately, Christine Johannes, who has generously volunteered to lead us with poetry, had a little bit of difficulty joining, but she is here now. So we will end the session with Christine's poetry, and I am going to pull you in, Christine, and I will briefly introduce you and then give you the floor. So Christine Yohannes is currently based in London, but she is originally from Ethiopia, and she is a writer and a poet, among many other things that she does as well. She participated in the International Writing Program, and since its founding in 1967, Ethiopia has sent 5 delegates. Christine is the only female representative from Ethiopia to have participated in this program. In 2016, she actually started a creative collective entitled Poetic Saturdays, based in Addis Ababa, that is still going. I will actually share some of the links to this initiative in the chat so that you can check out some of the incredible people that she's brought on board. The inspiration for this, I'm sure there's multiple inspirations, but Christine has moved countries and continents and jobs and many times over, as I'm sure many of you can relate in the audience. And throughout this process, she had wonderful support from women, and that's really helped her to thrive in these experiences. So she wanted to ensure that she was creating opportunities and kind of returning the favor, so to say, for other women, for youth, and for anyone really who has a creative voice and need an outlet. So that is part of the inspiration behind this collective. But that said, I will let Christine take over and share her poetry with us as we close the session and move on to the next panel. The floor is yours, Christine.
Thank you so much, Erica. I hope everybody can hear me. I'd like to first and foremost especially apologize to Nnimmo Bassey, because I wish I would have had the opportunity to introduce you before your speech. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I was listening to your answers, and it's so interesting because after I would be done reading the poem, I think people would think that you and I would have probably talked prior to this, because it's so in line with everything that you were saying so far. I'm especially grateful that you've mentioned Ubuntu, because having being born and having grown up in Ethiopia, I've seen what harmony with nature, what harmony with others can do, both for the environment and for for humans in general. And everything that you've been saying really reflects everything that I tried to capture and encapsulate in this poem. So thank you all for waiting, or for staying still to listen to this poem that I've prepared for this platform specifically. Nnimmo Bassey, I'm honored that I'll be able to read this in your presence. When I was 5, I used to pick leaves and dead flowers from the garden. The idea, without picking the ones alive, to recreate that of Eden. I'd collage the petals into different shapes and images, show them to my mom and dad, and it'd stay for ages. Dead flowers, rotten, yellow turned to brown and green to black. But as a child, I knew that it was a way of giving life back. By the time I was 10, I collected tiny pieces of candles, the ones that remained stuck on shampoo caps, saucers, and handles. Once it all filled a Tupperware, I'd melt them in an old pot, and with the help of my great-grandma, we made floating candles when the wax was no longer hot. As a kid, I knew that some things sometimes melted and almost fade. But given the chance, brighter they'll shine and anew they can be made. By the time I was 15, I had a mind of my own and thus my own fashion sense. Skirts were made into bags, jackets were never worn, but a pair of pants would be cut into a dress. Old tins with patterns were water bottles, and anything made a statement. Whatever was a daily statement, but bottom line, everything was reused without judgment. When I got to 20, my mother's clothes were fashionable. Walking to school and back was a la mode, and everything was reusable, repurposed, recycled, transformed, and morphed out of common sense. Sometimes necessity forced us, often lack of access. So this young mind understood that abundance created greed, but no one wanted to live with less, and so no one agreed. By 22, a paper on the environmental impact of the meat industry should have gotten me an A, as well as a piece on corporate social responsibility of the Den oil spill in Nigeria. But you can't speak of such things in business school. Are you risking your grades, risking your degree, you fool? So you get sent back with a, you don't understand how it works. And they were right, I didn't, but I'm glad I didn't sell my soul for perks. So fast forward to 30, where since then I've sold my soul to multiple corporations, when destroyed homes, farmlands, dying animals, and people made me want to seek abdications. I renounce my role as a consumer of anything that man creates. I revoke my hunger to succeed in a world that evil procreates, birthed from greed, pride, gluttony, and wrath. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. There is no ideal path. The youth want to save the only planet they can inherit, but those destroying it for profit have already planned their exit. No one listens to the younger ones, but they're given or allowed to speak, as though to give a sense of change, but it's smokes and mirrors with a leak. Decades of talks, discussions, and general meetings, decades of sounding alarms and no action sightings. Yes, recycle that bottle cap, but unless that factory closes, repurpose that glass bottle, but solar or petrol, where are your choices? Thank you.